Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Equals. This is Nabil, and it's going to be quite different, isn't it, Max?
Yeah, really different. Well, the world has changed.
Welcome, Nadia from DC.
Hi everyone. Yes, it's good to connect with you guys again in Nairobi, and feeling very far but very close in this tough time that everyone's facing.
Really are. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us out there. So for the next few episodes, Equals is going to be a little bit different. We know that coronavirus is dominating our world. We're living in a scary time, a difficult time. We know how this is touching so many of us in a very personal way. In the next few episodes of Equals, we're going to be looking at the relationship between coronavirus and so many things that affect ordinary people. We're going to kick off today with a conversation between Nadia, Max, and I, and over the next few episodes, look at issues from work to healthcare to just really the way that this virus affects the future of the world.
Yes, and the way that this virus is kind of interacting with inequality. It's feeding on existing inequalities. It's increasing inequalities, and it may have the seeds of much greater inequality in the future.
Yeah, it really is. Nadia, how is it over there, and how is it at home with your kids?
Yeah, I mean, we're all the schools have closed now, and that was expected. But when we saw those emails, it was still kind of a shock to the system. Putting away the backpacks, we've had them out by the door, and now they're back in the closet. But it's tough, balancing work, balancing the kids. We've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. One of them both of them need a lot of attention, 100% attention, but they need different types, and we're trying to give that to them, and sort of splitting the workday and the childcare and homeschooling between me and my partner. What about you guys?
Here in Nairobi, the schools have been closed now for a few weeks. In some ways, it's been nice to have my son and my daughter, similar ages to yours, at home. But I think my wife and I think we've just grown in massive respect for teachers the last few weeks.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I know everyone's saying it, but it's true. What an incredible job teachers do. I mean, it's really, really hard. My children, I knew they didn't respect me, but really, they really don't respect me.
And it's interesting. I mean, I think we can be open at this time, and we're all going through, in some way, similar experiences around the world. But my son is literally crawling up to me here as we record the podcast. So really, in this first episode, it'll be really interesting to kick off with something that Oxfam is thinking about and is raising its voice about, which is really the relationship between inequality and coronavirus.
Well, I mean, coming back to the schools point a bit, I mean, it's yes, it is hard homeschooling, but I have a job, and so does my wife, where we can both suddenly work at home. We can do half time. My employer is very flexible. These are generally more middle class professions. The economic impact. I mean, that really lays bare the difference. But we're relatively privileged and very lucky.
It's interesting you say that, because this pandemic is also exposing and exploiting the inequality that exists between women and men, because we know that women do the world's most insecure, poorly paid jobs, and they're facing that even more in this crisis. But we also know that women provide really for free, and we've talked about this in the past episode, all that care work that takes place, and we're depending on it more than ever.
Absolutely. I mean, think about just this homeschooling piece that we were talking about a minute ago. It's women who are going to bear the brunt of having to teach their children. It's women who are going to be caring for those younger ones and the older ones. It's women who are doing, the dishes, the extra dishes that are piling up, the extra laundry that's piling up. And also women who are, as you said, are in the most precarious jobs and most vulnerable at this time.
Yeah, I mean, we had in Kenya, one of the big exports is cut flowers to Europe, and they just made redundant 50,000 workers last week, and they're almost all women. So these supply chains all over the world, it's women that are losing their jobs. I think you'll also see a big spike in domestic violence, a huge amount of stress and tension and anxiety. And I think the other thing is that the health workers, 70% of the world's health workers are women. So the people on the front line fighting this virus, getting sick, are also women. So I think we're only just beginning to see the gendered impact of this crisis.
Absolutely. And it's the same situation that we're seeing all over the world, in countries where there are big section of the economy is informal economy. And in the US, I mean, so many people that are on contracts, or retail workers, restaurant workers, people that are, trying to start their own small businesses. I mean, all these people suddenly out of jobs. And just to give you one example, Virginia, which is the state adjacent to the one I live in, last year had an average number of unemployment claims of 65 per day. Okay, 65. Last week, what did we see? We saw 400 new unemployment claims on Monday, 2,000 on Tuesday, 4,000 on Wednesday, and 8,000 reported unemployment claims on Thursday. The numbers are staggering. And this is a trend we're seeing all over the world, right? Millions of workers losing their jobs.
And it's fascinating, this, because you say that, and obviously, Nadia, you're based in the United States. It's really, I think coronavirus is both exposing but also exploiting our very deeply unequal world, because we see this kind of difference of impact between the rich and the poor in countries around the world. Actually, I mean, if you're richer in wherever you may be, you're going to be more likely to have access to healthcare. You're going to be more likely to have cash to get by your reserves. Whilst most of humanity actually are facing this crisis with neither of those things. And I mean, I have to remind myself, we do live in a world in which the majority of humanity have neither of those things. 1 in 2 of us around the world earn less than $5.50 a day. And illness, we know, is so associated with poverty. So that's before going into this crisis. Goodness knows what the months ahead of us have.
I mean, it's really interesting, the parallels between a country like the US, which, I mean, has a very weak safety net, but at least has some kind of safety net. But you've still got this situation where most people are living from paycheck to paycheck. And it's exactly the same here in Kenya. I mean, the vast majority of workers, particularly women, are in the informal sector. They're paid on a cash in hand basis. They can't afford to miss more than 1 or 2 days' work before they don't have any food. And that's the reality. I suppose the big difference between Kenya and the US is, I mean, however weak the US safety net, there are unemployment checks, there is social security. I mean, there's literally nothing here. If you fall on hard times, it's your relatives, maybe friends might lend you some money, but this is going to happen to everybody at once.
Yeah, and I mean, you see things like, today, for example, early this morning, the US Senate passed a new massive stimulus bill of $2 trillion. And within that, there are a lot of things that are going to help a lot of Americans. Not all of them, but I think, we're seeing different rich countries put together new massive economic packages, and knowing that that's just not possible in so many other countries is terrifying.
You're so right, Nadia. And I think for me, it's interesting to just experience this from a personal perspective, because I have friends like you, Nadia, in the States. I'm from the UK. We're looking at massive government intervention on health and in the economy in the UK.
We've never seen before.
Unprecedented, right? And then look, Max and I were based here in Nairobi. It's a very different picture when it comes to the economy. Or I look at my family in Pakistan. I think what's clear here is that yes, definitely. I think a pandemic hits people very differently in any country you are in the world. But there's also something here to be said about the difference between rich countries and poor countries. We've got poor countries like here in Kenya, where the health system is weak. Countries are like this are drowning in debt. I think something like more than half the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are more than 50% in debt. Well, rich nations we're seeing in many countries are able to set up set up hospitals, and they're unlocking trillions to put back into their economy.
I remember from the financial crisis the way the world kind of rallied, particularly in London at the G20 in 2009, and put together a huge package that really did help poor countries. It was still helping rich countries more, but there was a kind of collective move, and I think we really, really need that kind of action from rich countries. On the one hand, to kind of free up the space from developing countries, and particularly, cancelling their debts or suspending their debt payments so they have more money of their own to spend. And then we need to see just a dramatic increase in aid, particularly for health, as fast as possible, because it's so short-sighted, because if the virus is anywhere, then it's everywhere, isn't it? And if it takes hold in developing countries and you manage to defeat it in the UK, for how long? It's just not. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
If ever there was a collective action problem, it's this one.
You're so right there, Max, because and it's interesting because in communities around the world, and we're seeing these stories of hope, aren't they, about communities pulling together, looking after their vulnerable, really going that extra mile in compassion to get through this crisis. But at the same time, I think we really need that sense of really global compassion of governments coming together and saying we're only going to get through this by leaving no country behind, by really leaving no person behind right now. And we really do need to see that global solidarity from governments come really fast.
I agree entirely, and I think that this is also a space where multilateralism comes in, and the role of groups like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the G20, in terms of coming together for global decision making from rich countries especially. And it's difficult because rich countries are facing this crisis themselves in a really difficult way, in a really hard way. I mean, like, New York is now the new epicenter of this crisis, along with Spain, and before that, Italy. I mean, these are countries that are also countries where we expect them to step up with respect to aid, and so we want them to come together. I think the IMF, as we said, and just referencing the 2008-2009 crisis, they played a big role then. And I think the world is looking to them to play a massive role now. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, has said that the IMF is ready to deploy their $1 trillion in reserve to support countries in need at this moment. The World Bank has announced at least $14 billion and is announcing more soon, probably. So, I mean, there's a lot of money out there in these multilateral institutions that needs to be activated, and it needs to be activated transparently and responsibly, because, where that money goes is really important, but the implications of repayment on a lot of that money is also something that we can't forget. And we have to learn lessons from 2008, 2009 as well there.
Couldn't agree more. We cannot have another decade of austerity as poor countries are forced to pay back. So yeah, I agree. I suppose I'm a bit more pessimistic because, the state of our national politics and the state of national politics in rich countries and in the G20, the narrow nationalism, the populism, multilateralism is probably at its lowest ebb when we need it to be its strongest in history. It's kind of the gap between the quality of our politicians and the size of the task is really dramatic.
Yeah, I think this pandemic, it really exposes how that road of narrow nationalism is a road to nowhere, actually, because it doesn't even help. It doesn't help the rich countries. It obviously doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help their citizens. So maybe a little less pessimistic than you, Max, that hopefully this pandemic acts as a springboard, as a global wake-up call that we do need to work together, that government is back, that, it's the only way to fight a crisis and lift humanity up through dark times.
Oh, I hope so. I mean, certainly on the health front, if ever there was a case for universal public health care for all, and I mean, very positively, we're hearing stories from countries like Costa Rica, Thailand, Sri Lanka, poor countries that have very good healthcare systems that are managing this crisis very well. So it's not the case that every country is, even the poorest countries are treating this badly. But yeah, the case for health investment, I mean, we were just doing some numbers today. In Italy, they're really struggling, and it's awful, the stories coming out of Italy, but they have one doctor for every 250 people. In Zambia, it's one doctor for every 10,000 people. So if Italy is struggling to cope, you can't begin to think what it's going to be like when it reaches these poor countries, and it will. It's just a matter of time.
That's exactly right. And I was on Twitter yesterday. Unusual for me, I know. But I read this. I was reading this Twitter thread from this emergency room ER doctor, talking about his experience, facing this crisis from an ER perspective, talking about, waking up and going into the hospital, and just every hour, tons and tons of patients coming in. They've learned how to identify these symptoms. it seems like that's all they're dealing with now. And he was saying, every hour they're having to decide who is going to be the patient that gets the ventilator. And I was just thinking, by the end of his day, he's already put 6 people or so on ventilators in one day, in one hospital, in one place. And meanwhile, they're in Sierra Leone, they're talking about having only 1 ventilator in the whole country. It's a just totally different world that that people are experiencing in a country like the US or the United Kingdom versus a country like Sierra Leone or even Uganda or the Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, it's just vastly different.
It is very different. I mean, poor people everywhere are really suffering, but just in terms of health provision and the availability of treatment, it's just so low in these developing countries.
At the same time, folks, we do see how, if you look at history, that the world is rebuilt through times of shock, and whilst this is a difficult time, I guess we shouldn't take our eye off the ball here about how our economies are being rebuilt. We're seeing the economic stimulus packages being put forward. How they're used is a really important question right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're seeing the rule book being ripped up and the unthinkable being thought about, the impossible becoming possible. A universal grant to all American citizens, the Irish and Spanish governments nationalising all private healthcare. Incredible things happening.
And the way that we're basically seeing a use of a universal basic income in many countries.
In many countries, you're seeing, and you are seeing lessons being learnt, I think, from the financial crisis, in that the bailout is not just going to big business and banks; it is being directed directly to ordinary people, and I think that's very positive. I think, as Nadia, you said earlier on, I think the other key lesson we have to learn is that, having ripped up the ball book and done these amazing things, that we don't kind of revert back to where we were before, and suddenly we have decades of austerity, and we don't fix the problem of taxing the rich and tax dodging. That poor people are made to pay the price of these bailouts for decades to come. But I think there's hope there. I think we've shown that things can happen, and we have to fight for a fairer world after this virus, not a more unequal one.
I would agree with that. I think that's a nice note to end on as well.
It really is, friends. I think there can be really no going back to that kind of that unequal, vulnerable world that we've had that's failed us now, right? And those kinds of foundations for a better world, they need to be built now, from free quality public healthcare for all, so we all have a doctor to go to universal social protection for all, to things like the Green New Deal. We really need to think about shifting our world irreversibly in that sustainable, more equal, kinder direction. So I should probably stop there. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks for at times bearing with the sound of our kids playing in the background. If you're listening to us for the first time, welcome to Equals. I should mention that we were super happy to hear from listeners out there who've been binging on our episodes so far. And if you're at home looking for something to listen to, well, we should have something for you, from talking to the very cool Anand Giridharadas about who should change our world, to talking to the world's top trade union leader Sharon Burrow about workers' rights, to US Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, she was brilliant, to the brilliant feminist economist and thinker Jayati Ghosh. There's lots of smart and hopeful and maybe even mildly inspirational stuff for everyone out there. So that's what we've had in the next few weeks. We really hope to look at some really interesting angles on coronavirus as we go through this challenging time. But if you have some ideas on what we could cover, do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. equals@oxfam.org. That's equals@oxfam.org.
And any stories you want to share with us about the personal experiences that you're facing or seeing around you, with respect to how this virus is changing your life or those around you, and how it impacts on inequality, please do let us know. Share your story with us at the same email.
Sure thing. Thanks, Nadia. Thanks everyone out there for joining us today. Stay safe. Do take care.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Stay healthy.